The front slide here establishes the nature of the challenge and the nature of the problem. This is a view down Dengley from the Larrig Group, a beautiful, wild, remote mountain landscape. No cultivation, mainly peat covered overall, and a difficult to access landscape. And at the bottom there is a 1 cent piece and a tiny, tiny flint core. And that is the flint core from which people were hitting that with a hammer of some kind and removing tiny little flakes and blades, which they used as part of their toolkit. So when we go out trying to find the Mesolithic in the Cairngorms, what we're looking for is the stuff that came off that core. We can be looking for things which are smaller than a 1 cent piece in a landscape the scale of the Cairngorms. And that fundamentally is the challenge of working in these landscapes. And that's why it's really important to get as big a group as possible engaged with this and to work with members of the local community, because without your assistance, there's no hope of success in this. Now, I'm speaking on behalf of a variety of different projects and an enormous number of people. The active fieldwork we've been doing has been running since 2013, first as a collaborative project between UCD, Aberdeen, Stirling, National Trust for Scotland. That was the Upper Dee Tributaries project, which did its last fieldwork season in 2016. And since then, I've been trying to get some of my own fieldwork started, but I'm speaking really on behalf of a collective. We've done this on very limited funding from a variety of different funding bodies over time, and we're very grateful to all of them for their support. I would particularly like to thank the staff at National Trust Mar Lodge, especially David Frew, the estate manager there, for fantastic support. Bruce Mann for his support through the project and for advice and continual backing, and the many, many volunteers and excavators who've worked on this project over the years. We couldn't have done this without them, and I'll highlight other people as we come through this. So we start just by way of reference for where we are. We're dealing with the Mesolithic period. This is the period after the end of the last ice age when Scotland was occupied by hunter-gatherers. In a European and British context, about this about being 9,700 to 4,000 BC. In Scotland, probably the dates are more like 8,500 to 4,000 BC. Just by way of reference, because it may come up in some of the discussion about landscapes, just to give you a sense of some other key dates here. Prior to about 12,500 BC, we're talking about the late glacial maximum. The Cairngorms were covered by ice and Scotland was uninhabited. There was in a warm period, the late glacial warm period, the late glacial interstadial from about 12,500 to 10,900 BC. There was then a very cold snap again when glaciers reformed in the Cairngorms. That's the Younger Dryas period, ending about 9,700 BC. And then we move into the Mesolithic period. It's just some of the landscape stuff I'll mention will reference back the late glacial and the interstadial. So just so you have a point of reference there. The image at the top here is a reminder of the difference of the Mesolithic. This is a reconstruction of a Mesolithic individual from Cheddar Gorge in Somerset, who ADNA analysis indicates that in common with Mesolithic communities along the western seaboards of Europe, Portugal, Ireland, Britain, they have a very distinctive and different pigmentation and coloration than modern populations. They have very dark skin, they have very dark hair, but they have piercingly green or blue eyes. It's a racial type, if you want to use that terminology, which is unknown today. And it's here as a reminder of how different this period is. These are Homo sapiens just like us. They have all the capacities, all the abilities we have, but they're also very, very different than us. And I also put it here as a reminder at a time when the British government is using more and more anti-immigration rhetoric. And in the news today, when we've seen film crews following migrant boats across the channels, simply filming them rather than just helping them, that we are all immigrants to the islands of Britain and Ireland. And unless you look an awful lot like this person here, you're not a first-generation immigrant. So you should perhaps learn some humility about how we treat those who follow us on those journeys. Okay, at a European level, Europe is a continent of mountains. According to varied European Commission's definitions, something like 60% of the population of Europe lives within 20 kilometers of a mountain, and 50% of Europe is what they call a mountain municipality. It's an area of land that has significant mountains within it. And these mountains are varied in character. Some are northern, some are higher than others, some are coastal, some are Mediterranean, but these mountain landscapes are really important. And we know from across Europe that the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who recolonized Northern Europe at the end of the last ice age started using mountain landscapes quickly, and they used them very extensively. It's one of the very distinctive things about this period of human prehistory that mountain landscapes begin to be exploited significantly. However, working in these landscapes is very difficult. It's difficult to find sites in these landscapes, and as a consequence, they often haven't received very much systematic attention from archaeologists, and it's been hard to truly know the distribution and character of human activity in these landscapes. And that's why the work that we've been doing in the Cairngorms has some significance, both telling us a story of the Cairngorm Mountains, but also telling us this story of human use of these mountain landscapes. The specific material we're talking about is mainly in Marlodge Estate, and particularly important sites here are in goldiebern, at Chest of Dee, and at Sgor an Owen, but also recent work that we carried out at Strone Baddock as well, to the south of Braemar above. The Marlodge finds were initially discovered in the early 2000s by people working on maintenance of the footpaths in this estate. They mainly lie off to the south of the Cairngorm Massif proper, and mainly on very significant access routes running across the mountains. And people undergoing routine footpath maintenance, volunteers working for the National Trust, had the ability to spot some very, very small pieces of flint on these footpaths as they were doing maintenance, and to realize that they were potentially of significance, to report them to the National Trust archaeologist, and everything that has happened since follows that observation and that reporting. If those footpath workers had not reported those finds, we would not have been able to do the things that we have since then. So that observation by the footpath workers and the reporting of that is really, really important. When I was doing my PhD, I worked in the mountain landscapes around Peebles in the Borders, and one of the sites we excavated there at Manor Bridge ended up being one of the earliest sites known in Scotland at the time. And it was only known because a local retired policeman walked his dog along the River Tweed every day. And he did that for decades. And every now and then on those walks, he would find the stone tool. Never more than one or two on any one occasion, and quite often he found none of them. But over the course of 15 years, he collected 300 or 400 stone tools from that location. So we knew that there was something important there. If I'd have gone in as a university team and walked over there for 1 day or 2 days, I would probably have found nothing, or maybe just 1 or 2 pieces, and wouldn't have seen it as any significance at all. But that sense of visibility people have who routinely live in, walk and move through these lands, they have the potential to find these types of sites in a way that most research teams really don't. So that observation from members of the local community is really important, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So National Trust Scotland faced something of a challenge. They knew they had these Mesolithic sites down near the rivers in different parts of the Marlodge estate, but they also had a commitment to reforestation of parts of the Marlodge estate as parts of the need to protect certain natural environments against the impacts of climate change. So Marlodge had a very significant management problem. How do we bring back trees near rivers, knowing that trees may damage the archaeology that we've only just discovered and we don't really understand properly? So because of that, National Trust were the primary supporters and primary funders of the first phase of the Upper Dee Tributaries project, which I'll talk about some of the sites now and what we did. So in order to understand those sites, the first thing we did, and this was mainly Richard Tipping and Wishart Mitchell's work, was produce geomorphological maps of the river valleys of the Dee and the Goldie, the main areas we were supposed to be working. These maps reflect the fact that the landscapes of the Cairngorms are incredibly dynamic. They change very significantly over time. And many of the land surfaces that currently characterize the Cairngorms weren't in the Mesolithic period. They're much more recent than that. many Mesolithic land surfaces have been removed by flood action. So the first thing was to get a good map that could tell us where it was worth looking for Mesolithic material, which of those landforms were of the appropriate date. We also had a recently completed PhD thesis by Danny Patterson from the University of Stirling, again working with Richard Tipping, which gave us a vegetation history for these key parts of the Cairngorm Mountains. No one will be too surprised to know that in the natural woodland environment of the Cairngorms for most of the time is pine woodland, but there's a little bit more going on than that as well. And importantly, in some places, the record of microcharcoal and the pollen sequences over time suggest that Mesolithic communities were disturbing these environments in some way, altering the natural succession processes of the woodland. So we have some sense of the landscape as a whole. We took that landscape level knowledge and then tried to focus in on a couple of the key sites which were there. So Kirkconnell Ruhr on the goldiebern and Chest of Dee. UCD led the fieldwork at Kirkconnell, University of Aberdeen led the fieldwork at Chest of Dee. And again, just to give you a sense of scale here, I walked up half an hour from the site to the other side of the valley to get a couple of photos of the landscape. And as we zoom in here very carefully and very slowly, the tiny, tiny dots in the bottom of that photo there are the students excavating the test pit on the hillside. So identifying sites in this landscape, finding where the traces of hunter-gatherer activity are, is genuinely very, very challenging. These are big landscapes and they are very small archaeological features. The environment at the time at Goldie was not quite what it is at present. This would have been a pine woodland giving way to some birch towards the tree line, towards the altitudinal limit of trees. So there would have been some open areas there. The goldiebern probably wasn't present as an open water course as such at this time, but you were looking across a very substantial waterlogged basin. And it may be important to note this basin at the moment is still an area that red deer like to gather, to feed, and to congregate. And that may be a reason that people settled here on this high ground just above the basin as a whole. The site itself is focused around a very small pit. This is the pit in the bottom here. You've got these classic peaty pod soils lying above it, lots of soil formation process, lots of movement of minerals within the soil profile make identifying delicate archaeological features very, very challenging. But we did find this in the center here, a pit containing lots and lots of charcoal. We also found an assemblage of flint artifacts. It's a very small assemblage. There's only 132 flint artifacts here in total. There's no cores. So there's none of the cores from which people were striking the flakes and blades. This is dominated entirely by the little microliths, so these little blades and flakes of stone that have been carefully shaped into these distinctive forms overall. 8 complete microliths, 22 fragments of microliths as well. Everything in this assemblage is quite burnt, often heavily, sometimes just lightly, but this is a very small, very, very unusual flint assemblage, highly specialized and burnt. It is also absolutely tiny. The average size of artifacts here is length 8.7 millimeters and width 4.8 millimeters. Less than a fingernail, substantially less than a fingernail. And our students identified most of these within 3 dimensions. We could individually locate the individual artifacts, and that was critical to understanding the site itself. But again, that emphasis on the small size of this material that we're trying to find. Those 132 artifacts were actually located very, very closely around that central pit containing charcoal. And I hope here you can make out that central contribution, but also running around that, an oval picked out by individual artifacts running around the edge there. What we think is happening there is you have some activity around the fireplace, but then other stuff forming up against that oval, which is scattering up against the edge of a tent or some other kind of structure. And we believe that we have reasonable evidence here for a small, it's about 3 meters by 2.2 meters, a small structure with a central fireplace within which people were carrying out a few activities. And you have a few pieces of flint you can imagine being knocked up against of that structure overall. Probably only big enough to have held perhaps 2, maybe 3 people at most, but a very small, discrete structure. We don't have any evidence on the ground for this. We don't have any post holes. We don't have any stake holes. We don't have an area of cleared stone. We are interpreting this solely on the distribution of artifacts, but most people we've spoken to think this is a reasonably plausible story. We did functional analysis. Annemieke Verbas of Leiden University looked at the edges of these microliths and flint blades and flakes, looking for characteristic patterns of damage associated with particular tasks. So we have some of the artifacts associated with impact scars, the sorts of things that might have resulted from them being used as projectiles. Some of them have been used for cutting, some of them have been used for scraping, some of them have been used for working animals, some of them with plants. And down at the bottom here, what might be a little tiny trace of a pine or birch tar resin, perhaps used to hold this microlith into a haft or a handle of some kind. What's really nice is when you actually take all of those different observations, artifacts, and you plot them out onto our structure here, the blue is everything that relates to the working of animals, either hide or meat overall. The green is plant, pink shooting overall. And there's just a hint maybe that within that tent, we have an area primarily associated with the processing of animal remains. Plant a little bit more varied. Hint of something functionally specific in there. The radiocarbon dates for activity here are quite interesting. We have 2 main concentrations. Trench 4 is the one I've mainly been showing you, and Trench 5 was just that little bit further down the slope. And both of them date to, roughly speaking, about 6,200 to 6,000 calibrated years BC. And that's really, really interesting because that's almost contemporary with a very, very significant climate deterioration in the early Holocene period, the so-called 8,200 calibrated years BP before present event. This was associated with changes in North Atlantic circulation. It saw average drops of temperature across Northern Europe of 2 or 3 degrees centigrade. It's very likely that glaciers reformed in the Cairngorms at this time. It is precisely the time you would have thought that hunter-gatherers did not want to go anywhere near the Cairngorm Mountains. But it appears that at goldiebern, towards the end of that cold period, was the period of time that hunters were moving into those landscapes. So it's a very interesting coincidence of timing. It's also worth noting that the charcoal from goldiebern, from Trench 4, included yew. And this is very unusual because yew should not, according to most of our understandings, should not be part of the natural woodland of this part of Scotland at this time. So it seems likely that this is being transported in with these groups of hunter-gatherers as they come into the landscape, maybe for some medicinal reason, lots of different possibilities there, but it's a hint of these complex patterns of movements of resources. So at goldiebern, what we have is a location on a low hillside above a wetland basin overall. There is at one point a small structure here, perhaps occupied for only 1 or 2 nights. The people who were there carried out some hunting and some processing of animal materials, but they also worked plant materials as well. They brought yew with them. Work by Rosie Bishop on the plant remains suggests that they were also collecting bearberry and crowberry, possibly for food or possibly for fuel. But hunting, Mesolithic activity involving the collection of bearberry and crowberry has not been recorded elsewhere in Britain. So it's a hint at something very different in these mountain landscapes overall. As to what they were doing there, it's hard to tell. Maybe they came there for the hunting. Maybe they came there because it's a natural access route around the southern part of the Cairngorms. And whilst they were there, they were doing some hunting. What we think is likely is that the burning on all of these microliths is indicating that microliths would have been composite tools. You would have had a row of perhaps 5 or 6 barbs in a haft set in resin. And in order to loosen that resin, you would have to have heated it slightly. So one possibility is that they're trying to fix their toolkit. They're taking out broken microliths, they're replacing them with new ones, heating those gently over a fire and then putting the new places in. So gearing up for the next tasks, the next activities. But one thing we can see, the activity we have in Trench 4, the activity we have in Trench 5, is this was a place that they came back to time and time again. So it's not just a one-off visit, this is a place that they keep on coming back to. So that's one aspect of people's activity in the Cairngorms. There's a slightly different story at Chest of Dee, and this is University of Aberdeen's excavations at Chest of Dee. This is the Dee running off up here into Glendy, the waterfalls at Chest of Dee here, and this is the Goldie running off in this direction. Again, it's important to think about the landscape here. So we have the Dee running down here, junction with the Goldie, and that carries on down below there. Work by Richard Tipping and colleagues on landscape reconstruction here has been able to pick out some fantastic detail. This main area across here with these heavy channels within it, that's a yokel halp. That is a massive boulder field caused by the catastrophic draining of an ice-dammed lake further up Glen Dee sometime in the late glacier. We don't have an exact date on that, but that's transported blocks of rock the size of cars. It's something of incredible ferocity, an incredible geomorphic event. This is the waterfalls at Chest of Dee itself here. It's really important to note that those waterfalls were not present in the earliest parts of the Mesolithic. The channel of the Dee ran along this side, ran along the very southern side of its current channel, and it's only after about 6,500 BC that the Dee changed course and started to incise the waterfalls of the cataract of the Dee itself. But banked up against that big late glacial deposit running along here in purple on here is a early Holocene river terrace. These are very, very fine silts that have accumulated over time, probably with seasonal flooding. Every year, a little bit more material being deposited. And those very, very fine silts, very, very well drained, are then the focus for Mesolithic activity. And in fact, there's a sequence, a stratified sequence of Mesolithic activity here, which is very, very rare in a British context. So Aberdeen worked excavating in these lovely silts, and they found a range of structural evidence. So we have things like a lovely fire pit in the center of this test pit here. Most of Aberdeen's excavations were quite small test pits. There's still an awful lot of the site there still to excavate, but we have very nice fire pits. We have concentrations of artifacts, that's the red stars here, associated with charcoal spreads. And Gordon and Caroline interpret these as potentially indicating structures because they have a very nice tight distribution. We have a very different lithic assemblage from Chest of Dee. There's about 1,400 lithics in total. There are microliths again, but there's also a much wider range of blades, flakes, cores, and production. So if the assemblage in goldiebern is very, very specialized, this is much more of a generalist kind of assemblage. Some of it is flint, but some of it, and that's on the right-hand side in this image here, is a rhyolite. Rhyolite is abundant in the Cairngorms, and it seems very likely that this material here is exploitation of a locally available raw material source, but we have not currently been able to identify exactly what that source would be. Rhyolite is super abundant in the Cairngorms, and with the extent of peat cover, it's very hard to map where all of these different exposures are, but a local raw material source appears to be being used. It's also important to note these three forms at the bottom here are a very distinctive type of microlith. These are so-called broad blade microliths, which are characteristic of the early Mesolithic in Britain. And the early Mesolithic in Britain remains very, very mysterious in Scotland, and it's very unusual to identify broad blade microliths in excavated context. So it's very significant that these are present. However, slightly confusing that these broad blade microliths here came out of a pit with radiocarbon dates at the Mesolithic Neolithic transition, so 4,000 years after we would expect them to be being used. So it's interesting they're there, but we still don't quite understand them fully. The radiocarbon sequence from Chest of D is extensive and shows repeated activity here over the long term. So the first activity is charcoal dating to about 8,000 BC. That is just charcoal from an occupation soil. It's not the most reliable date, but suggesting activity about 8,000 BC. There's then another phase round about 7,500 BC associated with a pit and flint working, and then quite a lot of activity sometime between about 7,000 and 6,500 BC. Most of those features, most of the artifacts are seen to be associated with that range of activity. And all of that takes place before the waterfalls at the Chest of D become active. And that's that blue column here showing when that change takes place. There's then another phase of activity at around 6,200 to 6,000 BC, maybe a little bit later than the cold snap of the 8200 event, maybe broadly contemporary with the activity in goldiebern, but we can't quite be certain about that. Another phase of activity at about 5,000 BC, another one on the Mesolithic Neolithic transition at about 3,800 BC, and that continues into the late Neolithic and into the Bronze Age. But Chest of D appears to have been a place which was being used, not all the time by hunter-gatherers, but used over a period of perhaps some 4,000 years as part of their routine uses of these mountain landscapes. So, trying to make sense of Chest of D is still challenging. As I say, there's still a lot of excavation that can be done there. It clearly is a persistent place, a place that people keep on coming back to over time, and a number of people working in mountain landscapes thinking about hunting and gathering groups and thinking about the intergenerational commitment to these places to keep on coming back to these familiar places. It's likely that the reasons for coming to Chest of D were many and varied. This again is a good access route overall. The resources of the river may well have been significant. The fact that this is an easy to get to place, an easily identifiable place, places where people could meet, these may all have been significant. But there's an awful lot we don't know. It would be easy to assume that this is perhaps connected to groups of people who also use the coasts at different times of the year, perhaps moving from the coasts to the inland in the summer. Certainly the flint that they're using is likely to originally come from coastal environments. But this is supposition. We don't know this for certain. And in other parts of Northwest Europe, there are very clear and very discrete inland and coastal populations. So that's an important area for further work to try and get this understanding of those links between different places. But it certainly appears to have been a very significant part of the landscape for a very long period of time. I promised in one of the emails and tweets about this to talk about a cursed archaeological site. So as part of our work with National Trust Scotland, we did further walkover survey trying to identify new sites. In doing this, I was having lots of conversations with my team about the value and worthwhileness of predicting where sites are. So thinking that looks like a good place to be if I was a hunter-gatherer. I'd want to go and camp in that location, and then confirming your efforts in looking in those places, which obviously can bring you good reward, but it also runs the risk of meaning that you only find stuff in the sorts of places that you imagine you might be finding stuff. So we tried doing a lot of blind survey, and then one of my teams, James Redmond, led a group up higher up into Glendee, and on the way back one day said, I'm going to have a look up there. That looks like a really good location to find hunting and gathering material. And immediately he did identify material on this really nice late glacial terrace at Score and Owen. And this is a terrace some 12 to 13 meters above the current height of the Dee. It's a river terrace. It was deposited by the river when the river was at a very different height. And it's located, it doesn't quite show in the photograph here, it's located at a very significant narrowing point of the Dee itself. So it's a nice, flat, I would say well drained, but it's not well drained at all. It's really wet and bloody horrible. But it's a nice flat terrace with really good views up and down the valley at this natural pinch point. We have found in 2 years worth of surface collection here, we found a grand total of 15 artifacts. They are not chronologically diagnostic at all. I think they're probably late glacial or Mesolithic, but they might not be. And again, they're tiny. The average length of these artifacts is only 12 millimeters overall. But the location here is, it's at over 550 meters above sea level. It's the highest prehistoric sites we have within Glendy itself. This site location is really interesting. So we felt it was significant enough to try and go back and do some preliminary field work. So in 2019, we persuaded the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland to give us some grant support to do that, which is fantastic. Had it all lined up, ready to go, when National Trust pointed out that a peregrine falcon had just nested above the cliffs, on the cliffs above the site, and therefore it was under an exclusion zone, and we weren't able to do field work there during the summer months at all. So we did something different, which I'll tell you something about in a minute. We went back to the Society of Antiquaries in 2020 and asked for grant support to go and do the work we were going to do in 2019, and they very kindly offered to support us. And then this happened, so we had to cancel all of the field work for 2020 as well. I am hopeful that barring birds of prey and global pandemics, we will be in a position to be able to do field work at this site in 2021. Whatever the curse is, it is clearly guarding something very significant and very important. All of which raises the question of what do you do in 2019 when you've already booked your ferry, you've already booked your accommodation, and you're not due to get refunds on all of those, but you haven't got the site that you were planning to go and work on. Well, I'm very grateful to Ali for putting me in touch with Neil Barnett, who had found a single flint on top of a very distinctive hill at Stroan-Baddock above Glen Cluny, directly south of Braemar. The flint itself was then donated to Braemar Castle and wasn't available for analysis. It is just one flint. Again, it's not chronologically diagnostic, but in the context of having paid for a field season and not having many places to go, we thought it would be worth a try to see what we could identify here. So with the assistance of Neil and Mark and the team, we dug a series of test pits in and around the area of that find in the summer of 2019. And yes, that is a tricorder being used to record the archaeology in the test pit on the right. The dug test pits in 3 areas, but mainly concentrating on the hilltop itself, ended up only identifying 3 or maybe 4 artifacts, all of them in a very, very tight area right on top of the hill, none of them chronologically diagnostic. Again, we worked really hard on this. We ended up digging test pits 1.25 meters apart from each other. It's the highest density test pit survey I can imagine trying to do, and we simply couldn't identify any more artifacts. Looking through local records of the area raises a couple of interesting possibilities. Yes, this could be a small area of prehistoric activity up on this hilltop, but Baddock also has a number of other place names. So there's a local place name here of Grant's Hen House, which reports a local farmer who used to keep poultry here. And apparently they kept them right up on the top of the hill so they would be free of disease. And there's particularly an Isabella Grant who's associated with a story from the 1911 census. And the Braemar Highland experience record this as the highest hen house in the UK. Most of the finds we had came from in and around this little right-angled relic of a structure of some kind. And it is possible that in the construction of that hen house, some material was imported onto this hillside in order to feed the hens, in order to make this area a little bit more comfortable for them. And it's possible that's how the prehistoric flint ended up there. The other possibility is this whole area was used very extensively for D-Day training. And this structure may be associated with the Canadian soldiers who were training up there. But either way, we have struggled to find any compelling evidence of hunter-gatherer activity at Baddock. We followed up another report of a find from a member of the public. This was found on a low terrace of the D. Here's the D, here's the Goldie, Chester D just up here. A record of a find a bit lower down. Again, we did some survey work here and identified a large pit cut the same silts and sediments along the bank of the D, and here's Rosie excavating that pit. That's full of pine charcoal and burnt stone. With the assistance of Bruce Mann, we got some radiocarbon dates for that. They are resolutely un-Mesolithic, but we have 2 radiocarbon dates from this pit which fall into the Iron Age, with the slight query as to why they're 2 different and incompatible Iron Age dates from the same pit. This is the first evidence for Iron Age activity in Mar Lodge and this part of the Cairngorms. So it's interesting in itself. The Mesolithic is hard to find in these upland landscapes, but other prehistory can be as well. So sometimes when you're looking for the Mesolithic, you find other things. So in terms of what's next, we have the goldiebern is published. The Chest of D site will be published in Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society within the next couple of weeks. And in terms of continuing this attempt to find more evidence of the Mesolithic, I'm hoping in 2021 that we will be able to get to Score and Owen and do some test pit survey there. And hopefully if that goes ahead, there'll be an opportunity for people to join us and volunteer in that activity. Hoping to do some walkover survey on the Cairngorm Plateau in 2021 to see if we can identify any sites up there, and I'll say something more about that in just a moment. And we've been trying to do a lot of awareness raising, particularly with the help of Dig It, reaching out to people who walk, work, and spend time in the mountains, encouraging them that if they do identify what look like prehistoric artifacts, that reporting them is a really, really important thing to do, because that's the best way we can find these leads to follow up. And come back to the point that the amazing work, the amazing sites, sorry, at Chest of D and in goldiebern, we only know about those because of the footpath workers who had the wit to realize that the pieces of tiny, tiny flint they'd found had been important. So in terms of the Cairngorm Plateau, it would be a dream of mine to identify material on the plateau itself. That would be quite a remarkable location for prehistoric activity. With thanks to Ian Cameron, who is Mr. Snow, and Martin Callanan of Trondheim University, we've been developing a hypothesis here that there are on the Cairngorm Plateau areas where snow and ice persists for very long periods of time each year. They're not permanent snow and ice, they're not true ice patches in that sense, but there are predictable locations where snow and ice persists. And actually these are really valuable ecological niches for animals. They are cooler, the mammals and birds congregate in these locations. And therefore, and in many northern cultures, these areas of ice and snow are very important places for hunting. They are reliable places where animals gather, so hunters gather in those areas. So a hypothesis for us to test is that these may have been areas that attracted human activity in the past, and that by looking around these areas of persistent snow and ice may be one way of trying to deal with those vast areas of the Cairngorm Plateau and see if we can identify the activities of hunters and gatherers up on those mountain tops. So that's some of the things I hope that we're going to be doing next year. I hope to have given you a sense of some of the things that we have been doing, of why it's useful, of why it's interesting, and of why it's kind of fun as well. It's a good excuse to spend time in the mountains. And thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you, Graeme. That was fantastic. I can see a splinter group from Mesolithic D-side called Extreme Mesolithic D-side. I think some of our group would be very keen on following up some of those leads and doing a few walkovers and reporting things to you. But
you'll be very welcome.
Does anybody have any questions? If they would like to ask a question and unmute, Graeme will try and answer.
Hi, Graeme. I have a question. Have you had any feedback in terms of what you're defining as the structure at the Chest of D?
Rob, no, I haven't had feedback on that. It's proof that's more Aberdeen's work than my work. The Geldy one, we have really quite a nice circle overall, and I'm reasonably confident in that. And in fairness, that one got through peer review as well, so we must have been persuasive. The Chest of D one is in the corner of a test pit, so it would be much harder to be certain. But those tight definitions of material can be associated with structures, but it's far from certain in that instance.
Right, okay, because I one of the feedbacks from my Viva was that what you define as a structure. So the ethnography I used for my particular structures at CNDR, the analogy didn't have lithic working within the structures of the hunter-gatherer ethnography. So one of the sort of the downsides of me using that interpretation was that there was no lithics potentially inside my structures. So it's something I've just come up against in terms of my Viva. So I just was interested for what sort of feedback you'd received.
Yeah, no, certainly some structures are identified as gaps in distributions of material, but other ones, structures are associated with material. But I think the Geldie one is probably a better parallel for you in that sense. And as I've presented that in numerous conferences, we got it through peer review. People seemed happy enough to accept that idea that in that case, a structure was being marked out in that way.
Lovely job, Leah, as I should say. Thank you.
Yes.
Anybody else want to ask Graeme a question?
Hi.
Hi, Sheila.
Hi, Ali. I was typing, but I'll just say my question now. Because during lockdown, quite a lot of people are out exercising who don't normally go out exercising, particularly up the Dee Valley. And one or two people have found lithics in higher up, not quite in the Dee Valley, but in the higher reaches, for example, in the top of Scalty and other areas. So I think it's something that people would enjoy doing. And I think the articles like Dig It, you know, if people are out walking and they start to get an eye in for it, I'm hoping that more people are going to report in, put their finding.
Yeah. Well, and Sheila, that's great if people are finding things, but it's essential they report it. Absolutely essential that it's reported, because these sites can be so low density. They can have so few artifacts on the top. Just coming along and picking up 2 or 3 things that are there may mean that it's effectively invisible for another decade for anyone else walking along. So it's the only way we can find things in these landscapes if people are out looking. It's absolutely essential that they report what they find.
Graeme, I've got there's a couple of questions on the chat. Ken, I don't know if he wants to ask his own question. He's asking, were precipitation and wind direction or strength in the Mesolithic period similar to now?
The climate changed over time, and the exact detail of that is difficult. There were periods of time when precipitation was less than it is at the moment. So that 8200 event I was talking about is generally recognized as being a very a cold and dry period, so less precipitation overall. Our knowledge of wind direction changes is somewhat less than that. I did, having spoken to Ian about the location of persistent areas of snow today, I did speak to the glacial geomorphologists who work in the Cairngorms and say, can we use the assumption that an area that is snowy and icy today may have been snowy and icy in the early Holocene? And they thought that that was a reasonable assumption. It is an assumption. It's not absolutely foolproof, but it is a reasonable assumption to make at the gross level patterns of wind direction and overall climate. It's a reasonable assumption, but there will have been variation in that. Does that answer your question, Ken?
I think we'll assume yes, Graeme. Joe, I don't know if Joe wants to ask his own question. He's asked, what do you think is the driving factor for the difference between assemblages at Chest of Dee and at Geldie?
It's a good question, and I'm wondering if that's Joe, who used to work on the project as well.
It is.
Hello, Joe. How are you? Good to hear from you. Excellent. I suspect the reality of it is that Geldie is reasonably specialist in terms of the activity that's taking place there, whereas there is a broader range of activity taking place at Chest of Dee. If you wanted to think about language like base camps at somewhere like Chest of Dee, whereas Geldie being a much more specialist site, that would be entirely appropriate. I'm very hesitant to talk about Geldie as being a hunting site. Yes, we know that people stopped there on one occasion and did some hunting, but they may well have stopped there because it was the convenient place to stop on their way through to somewhere else. That could have been driving what they were doing there. In lots of different reasons, and saying it is a hunting camp kind of closes those down a little bit. But I think one is specialist and one is much more general. I mean, with all of these, the certainly Geldie is under snow for very large parts of the year. The first time we went there trying to do geophysics in May, we only had just cleared snow overall. So this is somewhere which must have been only a summer or autumn occupation. And the same is probably true of Chest of Dee. I'm not sure I want to be in a campsite at Chest of Dee in a January or February overall. So these were not permanently occupied. These are seasonal sites occupied as part of broader systems. And as I say, we don't know how far those systems extend, whether they go the way all down to the coast. But the fact they're using coastal flint means they certainly have contact with coastal landscapes and coastal resources. Does that answer that, Joe?
It does. Thank you.
Just to lead on from that, Graeme, Jill has asked, how did people identify their earliest sites in such a large landscape when they came back to use them? Were there particular landscape features they could use? So, you know, in the summer it would obviously have been easier to see these, but even so, you know, what features were they using?
I think it's an interesting question, and I think it depends on what you mean by a site in some ways. So if you take Chest of Dee, for example, that's a major confluence of two large rivers, and you could easily imagine a set of directions to get to the confluence of the two large rivers and camp on the nice flat bit by the side of it, and that would bring people back to the same kind of place. This may also be something which over time becomes marked out by human activity. If you're returning there every year or every 2 years, fireplaces accumulate, there'll be a clearance accumulates overall. In many hunting and gathering societies, areas of long-term campsites are marked out by different vegetation. As people eat fruit, for example, and the seeds pass through them, toilet areas become marked by having larger proportions of fruit bushes growing. So there are really subtle impacts on the vegetation which take place, which hunter-gatherers would have been able to read very, very easily. So we may think of these as kind of wild and empty landscapes, but there would have been a whole series of cues which could have brought people back to particular locations here. The presence of the, okay, so the waterfall wasn't always present at Chest of Dee, but those rocky outcrops would have been. So that's another thing which gives a kind of lock in that landscape, an area to come back to. The site at Sgor an Owen, if it is Mesolithic, again, it's a reasonably clear landscape feature. It's the nice big flat bit where the valley opens out again. So they're actually reasonably easy to re-identify these places.
Graeme, I have a question from somebody whose name that I can't pronounce, I'm afraid. Shersham? Bradley? Saoirse. Oh, wow, another spelling for Saoirse. Fantastic. Saoirse, would you like to ask your question or do you want me to read it?
I can try if you can hear me. Is that okay?
We can hear you.
Hiya, it's Josephine. Sorry.
Josephine, sorry, I thought I saw the other name on there somewhere. Apologies.
No worries. Yeah, I had two questions actually. The first one was about, you mentioned the difficulty in looking at areas where you think would be a good site, as opposed to areas that you maybe wouldn't think. And I was wondering if there was any way that you could do sort of like, almost like pin the tail on the donkey, kind of random sampling. I don't know if that's something that you've considered or would be possible, given that you'd need permissions and things like that to dig in.
Yeah, I have considered random sampling, and it's something I've talked about with my team quite a lot. The difficulty is that kind of random sampling is heartbreaking and heartbreakingly slow. That on most of these, because most of the peat cover here is post-Mesolithic, to identify where sites are, you're either relying on areas of erosion, which is effectively just footpaths and the eroded riverbanks, or you're having to excavate test pits. And trying to cover large blank areas with test pits it's just horrible work. They did a large amount of this associated with infrastructural work in Norway in the 1980s, and they dug thousands of test pits and found very little material. And that was paid work, so it was a slightly different thing. asking students to come out and spend their summer digging thousands of test pits and not finding anything is a really good way of putting people off archaeology for life. So I'm not quite prepared to do that. So that remains really, really challenging. How you deal with the big blank spaces. And we haven't got a perfect solution to that at the moment. Anyone who has an answer, I'd be very delighted to hear it.
Thank you. My second question was, the broad blade microliths that you find at that sort of very unexpected date, do you think that suggests we might need to be more flexible in our considerations of what artifacts are chronologically diagnostic, or are they just an outlier?
Again, it's a good question. I wouldn't like to make too much of one broad blade microlith with one associated daily in an area that's been repeatedly reoccupied over time. I think there's potentially serious problems with residuality there. I think the significance of the broad blade microliths is that we're finding them in excavated contexts, and that does give us the possibility, if we could do more excavation there, of getting them with a better association with radiocarbon datable material and to take that from there. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that radiocarbon date at the moment. I don't think that has anything to do with the age of those broad blade microliths. But I think the fact that the microliths are present suggests, well, gives us the possibility of finding out more about them. And that remains a key problem in Scotland.
That's great. Thank you very much, Graeme. It was a brilliant talk.
Thank you.
Noopa in India has got several questions. Would you like to ask them yourself, Noopa?
Hi, Graeme. Hi, Eli. Hi, everyone. So yeah. So I have a few questions. First of all, very interesting talk, Graeme. I've been following your work and it's really interesting. So actually the landscape is completely different here in India. So you do not get any stratified sites basically for microliths, and dates are pushing back to 45,000 years in India. So my question is that did you find any faunal remains with charcoal and lithics? My first question. Any faunal remains? Did you find any faunal remains?
No. With the soils, sorry, I should have said the soils are very, very acidic. So no, we haven't got any faunal remains, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. Okay. So the broad blades you mentioned. So I saw one of the triangles there. So they are known as geometric microliths in India in the Holocene period. They appear in Holocene in India. So you do not call them as geometric microliths. You just
there's several different terminologies used for microliths as well. There's a broad blade and narrow blade, and people talk about geometric microliths as well. So different languages is used for them. It's overlapping and it's confusing at different times, but people do talk about geometric microliths as well.
Okay, so my last question for now is, did you find any manufacturing sites with debris or other core reduction materials?
Yeah, at Chest of D, the range of material at Chest of D includes cores, includes manufacturing debris as well, both in flint and in the rhyolite. That tiny flint core I showed at the very start, that's actually that's from Chest of D, and it's one of a number of cores of that size that come from that site. So Chest of D, there clearly is production of stone tools. The rhyolite that they're using probably coming local-ish. The flint being imported from coastal resources, sometimes as preformed cores, and sometimes worked down to that remarkably small size.
Oh, okay, very interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Not at all. Thank you.
Thanks, Noopa. Bev, would you like to ask your question?
I can do, yes. Hi, Graeme. Thanks for your talk. It's really good.
Thank you.
I was just asking or wondering, how many deer or other animals would have been available in the Mesolithic sites for hunting purposes?
I have no idea.
Okay.
No, that's one of those very good questions that completely catches me out. I can't speak. I can't give you any sense of knowledge for that answer in terms of the number of deer. We may also be thinking about reindeer or elk or other animals like that as well, but I can't quantify that in the slightest.
Okay, cheers. That's okay. Thank you.
Ken's not got a microphone, but he's just asked another question, and he wants to know why not stone shelters, easy to find now, and also maybe plentiful timber at that time.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not quite. Why are the shelters not built of stone?
Yes, I think that's what he's asking. Why is it not more obvious type of shelter? You know, you were saying that there was sort of stone scattered and lithics which were indicating where the shelter may have been, but why not a more permanent sort of structure?
But I think the permanency of a structure, the type of architecture used, relates to the function of that structure. If, to take the example at Geldy, if this is something that's only being used for 1 or 2 nights, perhaps whilst you're on a journey to somewhere else, then there's a variety of options. Maybe it's a structure that you're carrying with you, in which case it would be very, very light, like a modern tent. Maybe it's a structure that you're constructing with materials that you find on site, but you know you're only going to be there a day or 2, and you don't need to build anything stronger than that. Some really interesting work done by Silje Fritheim in Norway, looking at their mountain sites. And on some of them, she argues that they're bringing tent poles with them from the lowlands into the uplands, which are treeless, and they're leaving the tent poles there. And the tent poles are then acting as what she calls a space attractor. Year on year, people come back to that location because they have that cached resource that allows them to quickly construct the tent. So you can wrap skins around it, you can wrap bark around it, all those sorts of things. In terms of stones, what I had really hoped to be able to do, and we've not been able to do it yet, is identify tent rings. So if you imagine a tent made out of animal hide or perhaps birch or something, very often those would be weighed down by stones placed all around the bottom of it. And in a number of northern landscapes, particularly Scandinavia, you can really clearly identify those tent rings still in excavation. And one of the advantages of working up in the Cairngorms is this hasn't been cultivated. So there's not later cultivation that would have damaged and destroyed features like that. So we have the potential of identifying those tent rings overall. But I think that's you have to think about what function the structure is serving, and then that helps determine the architecture and the materials that are used for it. I hope that answers your question, Ken.
Richard, would you like to ask your question? I shall ask it. Richard wants to know if there's any indication that East Coast and West Coast Mesolithic peoples used this route for meeting or trading.
I am certain that they did. How we would actually demonstrate that would be challenging. You'd be needing to look at the distribution of raw materials. We would find it tricky, not impossible, but tricky to identify East Coast flint on the West Coast of Scotland. There are some distinctive West Coast Scottish materials which we would be able to identify more easily on the East Coast. I can't think of any of those off the top of my head, but I'm certain that people did move through those landscapes and did meet, but there's very little direct evidence of that. In fairness, if we were to look into the Neolithic, we would see much more material evidence for that sort of contact and movement. Whether that speaks to an increased frequency of contact, a different character of contact, I don't know. So I'm certain that people did make contact through those passes, through the centre of Scotland, but I can't point to any direct evidence that is the case.
Thank you. Debs, would you like to ask your question? No. So Debs says she's really intrigued by the idea of persistent places. When a place is, when is it persistent? How many episodes of human activity would be needed before you call it that? And over how long a period of time? Or is it just within human memory or over thousands of years?
It's another very good question. It's a term that's been stuck in the Mesolithic literature since the early 1990s. And no one has really tried to clarify all those very good aspects of definition that you've just asked about there. It's often to refer to somewhere which is repeatedly used over a fairly long period of time. In the case of Chest of Dee, that is a persistent place over millennia, but that includes substantial periods when, based on our current evidence, and remember we've only dug small parts of that site, based on our current evidence, there are periods of time when it's abandoned. Maybe that's related to climate change. Maybe that's related to other episodes of historical change. We don't know that at the moment. And whether when someone comes back to that site after 1,000 years, they have memory that people were there before them, that's a really difficult and really interesting question. You know, I spoke about the way in which the landscape might be marked by previous activity. Whether any of that could persist over 1,000 years, we simply don't know. So it's a really good question, and you've caught out the general archaeological vagueness of some of this terminology.
I've just read some papers recently and I can't remember the name of the author.
I'm going to try Shoshavine. Is that how you pronounce? Has asked another question. Do you want to come back and just ask that?
Yeah, just because it's what I did my PhD on, Graeme. Is there any, when talking about like the trade between the east and the west coast and stuff like that, and you mentioned the flint at the sites is potentially from coastal areas.
Yeah.
I just wanted to query, have you thought about looking into geochemical provenancing of the flint found in comparison to other deposits in perhaps northern England or the north of Ireland? Or
thought about it, but haven't done anything sensible on it at this stage. At the moment, our main assumptions have been either it's coming from the coast at the foot of the Dee, and there's aspects of it that look quite similar to that material, or potentially coming from the Moray Firth, but we haven't done anything systematic on that. I mean, it's a very logical step to try and take to actually resolve some of those questions, particularly when you have such discrete assemblages as the one goldiebern as well. So any suggestions you have, I'd be really interested to discuss that with you.
Yeah, if you want to fund a postdoc, that would be great. Thank you.
I may not be able to fund it very well, but
so that's all the questions that we've got. Is there anybody else?
Sorry, Ali, I can see Neil's got his hand up, which may indicate he wants to ask a question.
Hello, Neil. Sorry, the old-fashioned way, Neil. Sorry.
Not at all. Hi there, Graeme.
Hi, Neil.
Hi. I just wondered, you talked about traces of yew tree.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the context, presumably you've speculated about what the wood might have been used for, given where it's been used elsewhere in history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So yew shouldn't be there at that time in that particular type of landscape. So it's likely imported. A variety of different kind of folk remedies and folk uses of it. It is faintly toxic and perhaps could have been used in hunting in that context. It can also be used for ingesting to induce some forms of hallucinations and those sorts of things. So different possibilities, but many plants have a whole wide range of different forms of possible use. I think we sometimes think that hunter-gatherers get to where they get and then they find everything around them. One of the nice things about Geldy is not only are they bringing their stone tools with them, but they seem to be bringing plant resources with them as well. And it's just that useful reminder of all of that.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, Lorraine?
Is it used for bows? Yew
is a very good wood for bows. In fact, the wonderfully named Rotten Bottom bow from the Scottish borders is yew. It's a very good material for that. But what we have are twigs, so it's not a broken piece of a bow.
Okay.
I think that's probably all the questions. I've got lots of messages coming up, Graeme, thanking you very much for doing the talk. Obviously, thank you again to Angela for organising all of this and making sure everybody's in and got all the information. And thanks to everybody, obviously, for coming and listening. But thank you very much, Graeme, for doing that talk. It was excellent. I think everybody's enjoyed it, and lovely to be able to ask you questions personally as well and chat with you.
Oh, delighted to have the chance, and thank you all for so many really good and really interesting questions. And I'm really, really pleased we had so many people here.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks very much, everybody.